Good morning and welcome again to Coffee with Mr. V. And in order to participate in Coffee with Mr. V, you need to go and grab yourself a coffee or your favorite liquid, put it into a mug, a glass or a cup of any description. Come back and then we're going to do the synchronized sip, and that's going to be the best part of your day. So pause me if you need to. Here we go. 1, 2, 3. I love coffee. So today is day 1 of homeschooling. So yeah, that's going to be fun. School is now shut. I am working from home, hence the mobile whiteboard. And the children are around doing their own work, and hopefully they're going to leave me alone for 20 minutes as I do this. So today I thought I would go way back to one of the first parts of the course, the difference between the free market and the command economy. But being as though some of you are kind of right at the end of the course, it's quite neat to go back to this point and just use some of the more sophisticated concepts that we now have to make a little bit more sense of it compared to the first time we did it. So there is no kind of black or white science behind the difference between a free market and a command economy. Obviously, we have the definitions, but they only really exist in a hypothetical space. Free market is the absence of government intervention in its entirety in an economy, whereas the command economy, therefore, is state ownership of all of the industries in the economy. Another way of thinking about it is private ownership of industries, but also that those private industries get to keep the profit that they make from the factors of production that they use. Whereas in the command economy, it's not just state ownership, but it's the fact that the state gets to keep the profits that are made from those factors of production. One other interesting definition that I've seen using to differentiate the two is workers' wages. In the free market, in the labor market, free of government intervention, different workers are able to earn different wages based on their skill set. So the greater the skill set, the higher the marginal revenue product, and therefore the higher the wages. On the other hand, in the command economy, actually all workers, irrespective of their skill set, would earn exactly the same wage. And I think I'm less keen on that differentiation. I think that really comes from just the difference between, say, communism and capitalism, which I think brings into a kind of broader political aspect, whereas I just want to concentrate on the economics. The economics then is just about private ownership, private retention of the profits, or state ownership of factors of production and state ownership of those profits. That's what differentiates the two. In both the A-level and the IB spec, there are little nods towards particular economic theorists. You are meant to associate the free market with the works of Adam Smith and his great work, The Wealth of Nations in 1776, but also with Friedrich Hayek. And I think he's really there because you're also asked to do quite a lot with Keynes. And of course, Friedrich Hayek was the big antagonist of Keynes, the big, I wouldn't want to call him an enemy. I think they were on very good speaking terms. I think they used to write to each other quite a lot and they respected each other. But he's kind of the alter ego. He's kind of like the nemesis of Keynes. And we've got Karl Marx over here. Keynes probably goes somewhere in the middle. Keynes' obviously big contribution to economics was using government intervention to steer the USA out of its Great Depression in the 1930s. But I wouldn't say Keynes should deserve a place all the way over here in the command economy. Instead, that is reserved for Karl Marx, and obviously he was the author of the great Communist Manifesto, in which he argued for that kind of equal pay of all workers, seeing kind of the downside of this free market, which we'll go into now, and arguing that the state would be a better, resources would be better allocated by the state than by the free market. So one of the questions that quite often comes up, and it's right at the beginning of the A-level specification, and I always find it's a bit bizarre to put it there, because how can you answer the question is, what's better, the free market or the command economy? I think it's very difficult to answer that question when you've only done a couple of weeks economics. Actually, you need to come back and look at that question once you've done a bit more. And for some of you who've done a year, some of you have done 2 years, now you're probably in a much better place to actually have a go at answering this question. To think about the free market for a moment then, we can use our simple demand and supply diagram, the demand curve which has been determined by the law of diminishing marginal utility, and the supply curve that's determined by the law of diminishing marginal returns, which we've done in a previous episode. That gives us our market price. Remember, it's the market that determines the price, not the firm, and the equilibrium quantity. And the way that Smith argued the case that this was the best possible allocation of resources, because of course he didn't just argue that it was a way of allocating resources, he said it was the best way of allocating resources, was through the concept of consumer surplus, the difference between what consumers were willing and able to pay and what they did pay, which is this triangle here. And if you've forgotten how we derive that triangle, I might do a different session before, okay? But essentially what it's saying is, if this consumer here is willing and able to pay this price, but they only paid that price, then the distance between those two lines is essentially a measure of his or her utility, extra utility that they gain. And if you do that for all consumers that are represented on the demand curve, you get that area. You can also look at it from the producer's point of view, and you can say that the producer surplus, the difference between what they were willing and able to sell at, which is represented by the supply curve, and what they did sell at, is that area there. And again, that area is derived from this producer being willing and able to sell at this price, but actually receiving that price. That distance is the kind of producer surplus for that producer, but add that to the producer surplus for the next producer and the next producer, and suddenly you get all of that area. Adam Smith says that this is maximizing the community surplus being consumer surplus plus producer surplus. Okay, the community is made up of consumers and producers. Consumer surplus, community surplus is maximized. Let's have a think about that for just one moment. Okay, if we weren't in the free market and we had a dictator, okay, and the dictator said, actually, we need to produce Q2, Adam Smith says that this wouldn't be an appropriate allocation of resources, because actually we're now producing these resources here for which the marginal cost, remember this is a marginal cost curve, the marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefits, because remember this is a marginal benefits curve as well, that's how we derived it. So when the costs are bigger than the benefits, that is a waste of resources. We have misallocated our resources, so it'd actually be a market failure to do that. So we shouldn't produce at Q2, I'm going to take that off. Similarly, if we only produced at this level of output, let's call it Q0 for now, what Adam Smith says is, fine, we still get this bit of the consumer surplus and this bit of the producer surplus, but actually, why did we stop here? We could still have produced more units where the marginal benefit would have been greater than the marginal cost, and we would have got this triangle as well. So he might have shaded that in and called that welfare loss. It's not really welfare loss, it's just welfare not gain. So there we are. That's the free market. No government intervention, leading to the most optimal allocation of resources because community surplus of them is maximized. Well, it does, but then we spent half of theme 1 talking about all the different types of market failures, and we came up with quite a lot. So the most obvious ones I could draw here are things like externalities, negative externalities in production, negative externalities in consumption, positive externalities, but we could also talk about things like asymmetric information, public goods, common goods, the list goes on. And there are different market failures for both of your specifications, so have a look at those. All right, so one of the reasons why the free market isn't so great is because actually this diagram doesn't work so often. Instead, perhaps what people over at this side of the spectrum would argue is that you need government intervention to resolve those market failures. So where you have a negative externality, maybe you need to impose taxes. Where you have a positive externality, maybe you need to impose subsidies. Where you have a public goods problem, maybe the government needs to intervene and actually provide the good. Otherwise, because of the free rider problem, you wouldn't get the good at all. So these guys argue for government intervention for that case. The free marketeers would probably argue against that because they would say, actually, there is a risk of government failure. Government failure, remember, is when the government intervenes to try and fix a market failure, but actually ends up making the situation worse. There is an even greater net welfare loss in the economy as a result of the government failure. That's probably one of the main lines of kind of conflict between the two elements, the command economy and the free market economy. Another one would be the free marketeers over here are always arguing about the profit incentive. The profit incentive, remember over here, we're arguing for private ownership of factors of production, and I get to keep the profit that I make. And therefore, if I get to keep the profit that I make, I have this incentive to be as efficient as possible. X efficiency, productive efficiency, dynamic efficiency, driving my costs down so that I can make more and more supernormal profit. That's what's driving me. And free marketeers are all about that idea. The profit motive is everything. Karl Marx, on the other hand, looks at that situation and says, well, that may well be good for the capitalists, the owners of the factors of production, but they're doing it at the expense of the worker. And actually, it causes huge income inequality problems. Okay, whilst the rich get richer, the poor essentially get poorer. And even if they don't necessarily get poorer, even if their wealth or their income increases slightly, the gap between the two, the rich and the poor, is getting ever wider. Okay, so inequality is not just about people at the bottom getting poorer. It may be that their incomes are rising, but the gap between the two is getting bigger. Of course, free marketeer doesn't necessarily say that income inequality is a bad thing. If we're all equal over here in our pure command economy, in our communist state where everybody earns the same wages, irrespective of their skill level and their entrepreneurial ability, then you've lost the profit motive. And free marketeers will constantly critique state-owned industries for, not being efficient, for being, fat and bloated, and that's really a sense of inefficiency, that they haven't made the cost reductions necessary to be competitive. So they would look at that and say, well, actually, income inequality to some degree is necessary, and we shouldn't aim for this idea of perfect equality because it takes away the incentives to work harder, be more productive, and for firms to be more efficient. I'm not telling you which side of the spectrum you need to be on. And in fact, you don't necessarily need to choose a side. You can certainly be on the middle ground if you want. But if you ever get the question, it's nice to sort of be able to at least espouse the views of both sides. So even if you consider yourself to be a free marketeer, it's useful to know what the main lines of argument for the command economists are. The idea of income equality, equity, it's fairer, and fixing the market failures here. But similarly, if you're a lefty, okay, because command economies are more associated with left-wing politics, like Labour or like the Democrats in America, their main arguments or their main criticisms of the free market is that it leads to income inequality, and actually there are huge market failures that happen all the time. So I'm going to leave it there, but if you have any questions about this, please leave them below and I'll get back to them in the next episode. For now then, I will just recap and answer some questions on yesterday's episode. So yesterday's episode was about profit maximization. And the first question that came in was just to recap basically on the relationship between the short run average cost curve, average revenue, and profit. And maybe I didn't do a great job of that. So I'm going to do it slightly differently this time. I'm going to do it from the point of view of a perfectly elastic demand curve. So those of you in the upper six will recognize this as a perfect competition diagram. For those of you who don't worry, it's just a normal demand curve, except this time it's perfectly horizontal and perfectly flat. So remember, that's our AR curve. Since the gradient is 0, then it is also the marginal revenue curve, because twice the gradient 0 is still 0. This is the one and only time that the average revenue and the marginal revenue curve will actually be the same thing. Most of the time you'll see them split apart. But since this is perfectly flat, that's why it happens. If you remember, then the next thing I told you to always draw is the marginal cost curve. And because you now have marginal cost and marginal revenue, you can put in Q1, the profit maximizing level of output. You can read up to AR, and you can also put in the price. Now we do AC, and making sure that our minimum point goes through MC. And we have our smiley face, okay? Now, I can do this before drawing the graph just to talk you through it. The key points then really are everything from the origin all the way up to this point here. Let's call it Q0. Hopefully what you'll notice here then is the average cost curve is above the average revenue curve. So for any level of output between 0 and Q0, revenue is less than costs, yeah? Or to put it a different way, average cost is bigger than average revenue, which means you're making a loss. Then as we read along here, I'll ignore Q1 for a moment, okay? The next time those two lines intersect is here. So let's call that Q2. After Q2, it's the same as before Q0. AC is now above AR. So again, we know therefore that beyond here, we must be making a loss as well. So we know that the firm is making a loss at any level of output between 0 and Q0 and anything beyond Q2. So for what it's worth, this is because they haven't quite yet paid off their fixed costs, and beyond here, now their variable costs are getting too high. So actually their revenue, their costs are so high because of their variable costs that actually the revenue doesn't cover that. So we know therefore that they must be making a profit at any point between Q0 and Q1. And that's because the AC curve here is below the AR curve, the AR curve being there. We also know because MC equals AR, MC equals MR at that point, that this is the profit maximizing point. So if I draw a profit graph, and there is no expectation for either A-level or IB to ever draw a profit graph, but I'm just trying to show you what it would look like. There would be no profit before Q0, so it would actually be a loss. Then it would increase until Q1, and then it would decrease here. Okay, so that would be total profit graph, okay, and that's how they're linked. So hopefully that's done the job of what I was meant to be doing yesterday. The other question that I received that I thought I'd go through now is just a little bit of clarity again on the difference between accounting profit and economic profit. So accounting profit, remember, is the sort of profit that I imagine you're familiar with. You don't need to have done business studies. It's the profit that everybody in any financial magazine, well, any magazine ever or any book would ever talk about. It is simply revenue minus costs, okay? That gives you accounting profit. And as I say, in any other walk of life, most people would just stick there. Profit is profit, and there is no reason to have a different type of profit, okay? But economists are weird. Economists like to study all the alternatives. And in this case, the big alternative that we're looking at is what else could I have done with my factors of production, okay? Again, economics is always about the study of alternatives, but also of resource allocation. What else could I have done with my resources? Could I have put them into a more profitable industry? In order to work out whether that is true or not, you need to choose, you need to look at your revenue, your operating costs, and your opportunity cost. And the opportunity cost is the accounting profit that you would have made in another industry, okay? So that when I say opportunity cost, that is the accounting profit if you'd have taken all your resources and moved them on, you'd reallocated them into a different industry. from switching factors of production into a new industry. Now, to some extent, this is hypothetical, because how would you know what the accounting profit is likely to be by switching into another profit? It assumes that somebody is doing their research and working out, well, if I take my labor and I take my machinery and I suddenly start making, well, to give a very good current example, if I start making ventilators rather than cars, how much profit am I likely to be made for that? And I will stop at that point. I don't think anybody's making ventilators at the moment for profit, but you get what I mean. If I'm Apple and I stop making mobile phones and I suddenly go into the furniture business, how much profit am I likely to make from that? So I think to choose slightly different numbers from yesterday, if you have revenue of 200 and operating costs of 700, and then we know that we're making 1,300 or 1,300 pounds accounting profit. But if I also know that by taking my resources into another industry, I could have made 1,500 pounds profit, then you already know, actually, I would have been better off in that industry because 1,500 is better than 1,300. But if you follow this formula, you would end up with minus 200. So although this is a by accounting profit terms, this is a profitable industry, I'm making 1,300 pounds. Okay, in economic profit terms, the answer is that you need to pack up, get your resources, and go into a different industry. And I hope that helps put some clarity on yesterday's episode. Right, hopefully that was all right. And next time you see me, I will do something else. All right, cheerio, bye, stay safe.